This is Hunt Nebraska, the official podcast for insight into Nebraska's hunting and shooting sports community. Be sure to give us a follow on Facebook, our space for sharing stories, information, tips, and techniques. Now, Hunt Nebraska.
And welcome everybody back into the cabin here today. We have a very special guest here, and we're excited to talk a lot about some big game hunting and hunting stories and success. But first, we better go around and introduce ourselves. I'm Kyle Gasson, the Hunter Education Coordinator.
I'm Rachel Carlson, the Shooting Ranges and Shooting Sports Coordinator.
I'm Hershy. I just snuck in today. I thought I was the special guest, to be honest with you. But I do want to point out before we, just so that you know this is legit, Luke. All right. Okay. This is our award, 2024. And folks, by the time you listen to this, it may be 2025. That's why we're trying to do even better. So this is, well, read that, Luke. You've got a good radio voice.
It says the 2024 Outstanding Achievement in Field Excellence, Western Regional. Second place for the podcast.
Second
division.
Place, right. That's right.
There appears to be some painter's tape on there too, but
well, yeah, I mean,
it's official. It's official painter's tape.
I mean, this is probably authentic particle board right there. You can't just, you got to spend the money on that. You got to shave it from other places. Yeah. So, but we're going to try to get first place in 2025.
Sounds good.
And it starts here. It starts here.
Yeah, we were just talking about goals. I think that's a great goal for 2025.
Yeah, first place podcast division.
Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, we do have a special guest here. And so today we brought in the Big Game Program Manager, Luke Meduna. So go ahead and say hi. And as you know, you're being recorded too, so you can wave and say hi to everyone as well.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
Well, and this is something that, folks, you got to check this out on YouTube. You can do audio only, right, on whatever listening platform. But because I'm sure there's a lot of folks that read your comments on like message boards and Facebook postings and might not really understand what they're looking like. So this way, if you look at the camera, they can decide, that's kind of what I envision in my mind. Do you know how that works when you're reading a book or you're listening to something, an audio book or something? You just like, you got this idea of what the character looks like. And then when the movie comes out, do they live up to that?
Funny story, the meeting the Monday night when we were up at Columbus, I had somebody come up and tell me that I was younger than he thought because I'd interacted with him on one of the forums. You're younger than I thought you were. And I was thinking in my head, I bet I'm older than you think I am.
Oh, so. There you go. There you go. It's that lighter hair. Yeah. I think it doesn't silver quite as quickly. Now, I've had some people come up to me, hey, I listened to you on blah, blah, blah on the Omaha radio station and the Omaha TV. And like, you think I'm Greg Wagner, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're Greg. Yeah, that's your. And it's like, no, he's better looking than I am, and all that. So, well, good. They recognize you. That's a plus.
So,
good. And as you said, you're already going around to some meetings. So, can you? When I talked to you trying to get it lined up, you said you're going to be gone multiple nights over the next month and a half. So, how many days, or pretty much how many nights do you have planned out with meetings here coming up?
So. Yeah, currently, right now, we're in the middle of all of our winter big game meetings. We are going to North Platte tonight. We were at Columbus on Monday. Last week, I wasn't able to make it to Valentine on Monday, but then O'Neill was on Wednesday. So we've got 4 of those in December, and then there's 6 more in January. We have 2 of them in each of our wildlife regions. So we get spread out across the state pretty good. And then in addition to that, I've got 2 of my online ones that we do via Zoom that people can register for and attend. So yeah, there's a lot of public meetings, a lot of public input, a lot of sharing what we've what we're going through right now and what we're seeing for results and all that.
So I'm guessing, Luke, that on those regional ones, you're talking statewide stuff, but you're also hitting on a little bit more within.
We highlight
district.
the statewide stuff, but then we spend a little more time on those local units that those that are right around where those meetings are.
And then on the Zoom ones, is that more of just the
That's
statewide?
Pretty much statewide is what I focus on. I probably tend to wade into some of the statewide weeds a little bit more and spend a little more time on turkeys and rather than just hitting the deer highlights and trying to move through that quickly. The in-person ones. We tend to have they start at we open the doors at 6:30 or whenever we get there. A lot of times it's 6:15, and people come in and we kind of have an open house format to talk to people and spend time chatting, because we found that the one-on-one time with staff and the public is just the most valuable part of it. Historically they'd always start at 7. We do a half hour, 45-minute presentation, and then do questions for another hour. It gets done at 9, and there's a handful of times we're standing around talking to people till 10:30. We'll stand around and talk to people until everybody's gone. But we found that it's just a much better use of people's time to chat beforehand. We still stand around afterwards for as long as people want, but it's just a better use of people's time. We don't keep everybody there until 10 or
that's pretty cool.
10:30 at night. So.
Now the in-person just show up. Mm-hmm. The online ones, you've got to get the link.
Got to register for, so you can get that Zoom link. So we don't have the Zoom bandits topping in on random meetings.
Those are just excellent things for all of our listeners and folks involved, whether they hunt, they own land, have an interest in our deer herd, because these belong to everybody.
Right.
To get to add some input and ask questions.
Yeah, and we have all sorts of people show up to both the online and the in-person ones. A lot of hunters, a lot of landowners, and even just people from town that have an interest in wildlife.
Good.
So we get.
That's awesome.
Yep.
So where would people find out where these meetings or when these meetings are taking place?
So the easiest way is just to get on our website. You can actually find them in the calendar function on our website, or if you just search the search bar on our website is the best way to find stuff. If you just type winter big game meetings, that's going to be the easiest way to find them. We've had press releases, and I think everybody got an email here over the last month about that.
Now, I think I hear people call these the deer meetings, and you guys obviously cover deer,
yeah,
mule deer, white-tailed deer. What other big game critters do you guys talk about, or have you been talking about?
We typically cover a little bit of details on turkeys. That mainly focuses on the recent changes we've made. Just to kind of highlight some of that, just so make sure people are aware. And then we'll talk in areas that have elk, we'll talk about elk. Out west, we'll talk about pronghorn, cover those, and then. As needed, Sam Wilson has gone to a number of these to talk about lions, as well as if sheep questions come up, we'll try to address those out west too.
Right there. I mean, that's a go-to. We're going to have to figure out our Sam Wilson guys, because I think that's just one of those when the conversation starts to weighing down a little bit on deer and elk and pronghorn, all that type of stuff. You probably just look at Sam Wilson, mountain lions. Who's got questions for him? Because that's when everybody seems to have a question.
Yeah.
Do they come in black? Do they come in black mountain lions? Can I get them with spots? All that type of stuff. Because that's one everyone's got an opinion about, one way or the other, which is pretty cool. When you mentioned turkeys, do we have a turkey biologist now?
Starting fairly soon, mid-January is when Carly will come on and take over those responsibilities. Now, it's a partnership position within WTF.
Is that position then the turkey program manager?
Yes.
Okay.
So that won't be under me anymore. So that'll be a big help.
And folks, you can see just a little curve to the smile right there, because that's a unique critter to begin with, but also when you're talking deer, that's almost a full-time job right there.
It really is.
All the other big game.
Yeah, most other states, in my informal research, I think Arizona is the only other state where their big game program manager oversees deer and turkeys. Every other state and they do have some people that work specifically on turkeys in Arizona, so it's not entirely apples to apples, but most other, especially the eastern states, they've all got somebody that handles turkey, and I'm the only one that goes to wears both hats, and it's incredibly difficult. Turkeys can be all consuming if you let them
nowadays.
And
a lot of research going on, a lot of things being found out. We can't manage them like pheasants. We can't manage them quite like deer. They're just kind of their own unique critter. We find that out with a lot of things. But, Arizona is also a state not perhaps known for turkeys like Nebraska is.
Yeah, a little different.
Biologists there. They also have, now if I remember right, is it New Mexico or Arizona that also has some of the population of that really uncommon subspecies, the Goulds?
The Goulds, yeah, that's Arizona.
That
they've got a mix of some, I believe they've got a fair number of Merriams, but they've also got Goulds, and that's...
and they've got a pretty decent presence from the National Wild Turkey Federation, I think, for some of that, and then some of the indigenous tribes that they've worked with over the years in Arizona that hold the wild turkey in high regard. So, all right, I'm excited. Have you guys been to a big game public meeting yet this year?
This year, no. My local one is coming up right after the new year, so I was thinking maybe sneaking down to that one.
I think the closest one is Ashland to.
Yep, Ashland is kind of our metro one this year, halfway between Lincoln and Omaha.
And I've been able to make some of the Zoom ones. If you can't make an in-person, I highly suggest you try to make an in-person there. Get to meet some of the other faces and all that, because we do the in-person, or the virtual one on Zoom. And it's sometimes hard to see everybody and interact and be able to go over and, all right, I want to go talk to so-and-so from this district, or talk to Sam, or go talk to this individual. It's a little difficult to do that on Zoom, or an in-person, like you said. You guys are a little bit more available.
And we have, quite often, at the in-person ones, half the people there are staff. We have pretty good representation from, law enforcement. Occasionally we'll have parks people there. Quite often might even be a fishery staff. But then a lot of wildlife staff is there. All the local staff is as well. So we try to have Lincoln staff at every one of them. There's 3 of us from Lincoln going out to North Platte tonight. So,
and Rachel, I've heard every once in a while there's a shooting range question or shooting question that pops up.
Pops up at those meetings?
At some of the meetings. The virtual probably a little bit more often.
Yeah.
But anyhow.
You need to know where to sight in your rifle for the upcoming season, or where we can go, where you can do target shooting at.
Yep. If you don't have a formal range in your area, again, look at those WMA regulations. They'll tell you where you can and where you can't take your rifle out, do some sight in.
All right. So we're talking a lot about this meeting. So what we kind of figure we get into give a little taste of kind of what you might experience at this meeting. So we're kind of hoping to get some heads up, or a tease pretty much for anybody who does go to these meetings, of what they might expect. Some of the, we don't need the full 30, 45-minute presentation, but do you have some highlights of some of the different topics you guys would talk about at these meetings?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we highlight on at each of them is just talking about the results of our November firearm season. Just sharing the results from those 9 days.
I'm curious.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just about everybody is.
Yeah, and so if you want to dive into that, we sure can.
Sure, let's jump in. I kind of want to hear. I know I've seen some of the early press release, kind of the preliminary numbers, but I figured, I want to know, which means probably a few other hunters would like to kind of know. How did this last November season go? So just comparing those 9 days, compared to last year, our harvest was down 2%, which traditionally historically we're definitely down. Over the 5-year average, we're down 25 to 30% overall. The one thing about that, the one caveat in that, is that we actually cut our November firearm permits by 13%. The antlerless permits were cut by 37%. So we had some pretty massive cuts coming into this year. And for our harvest to basically stay stable means that success was up, and success was up a couple percentage points. If we're, and it doesn't mean everything's all good and dandy. Deer populations are still definitely down. We're still going to work to try to build deer populations up across to, a fairly wide swath of the state. But what the good news is that it seems like some of those changes we've made over the last few years are starting to take effect, with success rates being a little higher. And so some of that, I think we're kind of getting that curve to start to change direction, instead of what we've seen the last 4 years of down, down, down. I think hopefully we're seeing things level out, and then hopefully in some places increase, particularly on the mule deer side. Statewide, our mule deer buck harvest was up 7%, and that's with permit cuts, and all that. So, and, anecdotally, just hearing from people, they've said that they're seeing more mule deer this year than they have. And, we've really ratcheted down our antlerless mule deer harvest over the last 3 or 4 years. We went from pretty aggressive to almost nothing at all.
And a part of that, I assume, is a response to not just the population size, but here in Nebraska, traditionally, mule deer inhabited almost the western half.
Yeah,
of
western half, western 2/3 probably historically.
Okay, even further. And whitetails have just kind of slowly been moving westerly.
Correct.
I mean, some areas probably have had them forever, but we're more predominantly mule deer than whitetails, and now in some of those spots, it's almost flipped completely.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And in our harvest in the 70s and up into the 80s was still statewide harvest was predominantly mule deer. And then that, sometime I think in the 80s is when that, when they crossed, and we started getting a lot more whitetails, particularly and it was just simply the whitetail numbers in the east just, overwhelmed. Like whatever the west could possibly produce for mule deer. But yeah, we have seen like in Western units, particularly like Upper Platte and Plains, have historically been, almost entirely mule deer. And then we've had whitetail numbers start to increase. They still haven't, surpassed what mule deer are in those units, but they've started to increase out there.
Like you said, just experience that we had this last year when we did an adult new hunter event out by Gordon, Nebraska on the McGinley Ranch, right out there in the hills. I mean, you talk about what I envision as kind of being classic mule deer habitat up there in the hills, and all the deer harvested were whitetails.
Yeah.
And talking to the ranch manager there, 80% of what they see are oftentimes whitetails.
Right.
Their mule deer populations had some ebb and flow, and I think disease probably played into that more than anything else. Yep. But at the same token, it's just like, wow, that's quite a shift in what I would see as muley habitat.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a lot of that, like, historically, like in the Pine Ridge where we've had timber, 20 years ago, I would have said that was usually about a 50-50 split whitetail muley.
Yeah.
It's probably 75-25 in favor of whitetails now. We're starting to see more whitetails on the plains. The other part of all that, like with, some of our reduced whitetail numbers, a lot of those Western units, they're still going to see us be fairly aggressive on our whitetails because we want to manage those units for mule deer. That's there's just the cultural, that's mule deer country, and we want to keep it that way.
Out there, they call them God's deer and whitetails.
Yeah.
I don't know if that shows any bias or not, but they're definitely a bias towards muleys for a lot of folks.
Right.
And which is kind of cool. I mean, how many of us in here have actually taken a mule deer?
No.
Oh.
Half of us is all.
Yeah.
I've never
Us
even
from the
taken a
western
poke
half
at
of
one.
the
I've been on some mule deer hunts, but you can tell my guess and my luck on deer. But
No. And so some of the numbers, I go back to the numbers. I'm that analytical mindset of person here. If you look over, I'm taking notes. Here's numbers here. Here's numbers here. But obviously, as everyone knows, the population trend's kind of gone down the last few years. Can you give some of the guidance on or insight onto what maybe caused some of that decrease in population versus the increase, and why it's starting, and what you believe is starting to, hopefully now it's starting to go back, hopefully making an uptick?
Yeah. So, you kind of got to, like the whole story, you kind of got to step back to 2017, 2018, 2019, when both our whitetail and mule deer numbers were doing really well, and in a number of areas too well. About 2019, we were really hearing from our landowners on both whitetails and muleys in several different parts of the state where we were asked to reduce deer numbers. And so through all that, we had ramped up antlerless permits and antlerless harvest in response to that. But what we couldn't foresee is, after that, the major flooding in 2019 is that it basically wouldn't rain again for like 4 years. Mm-hmm. We entered into a drought, fairly severe drought conditions across most of the state. And so it was, in turn, it's always, I always refer to, deer management as a pretty big ship that it's hard to change direction very fast. And in that, even though we saw drought conditions in 2020, and especially into 2021, we were still a little reluctant to drop our antlerless permits too quick because we know how quickly whitetails can rebound, and we didn't want to, cut them way down and all of a sudden we're in trouble again by 2024. And so, we cut permits some, but then drought continues through 22, and it's like, oh man, we didn't cut enough, so we cut a little more. And
so you can't predict the weather. Is what you're
can't.
Saying,
well, and it's
to an extent.
Even the long term, it's like 1 year drought. It's like, okay, we can respond to that.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of been our approach. But man, trying to plan for 4 years of drought, and we've had significant EHD events, which tend to follow, drought conditions. So there's been, mortality to all age classes, in that regard. But the fawn production on both whitetails and muleys has been down these last few years. When you've got drought conditions, there's just less cover out there, less places for those fawns to hide. There's less nutrition. The nutrition's poor, so you're just gonna have reduced survival, and that's really hard to plan, and incorporate. We, like I said, we can respond to 1 year and kind of hedge our bets, but it's really hard when you keep getting hammered and hammered and hammered.
And like you said, you kind of plan for it. I know that just, again, hearing from the field where I spend time the observations I have from the field, during the good years, those white-tailed does are having twins. A lot of times having twins, and all of a sudden you realize, well, if one doe equals 3 by the end of summer, that doesn't take long for that population to bounce back when you're trying to reduce numbers. But if all of a sudden, if all of a sudden during drought conditions and mom's not in great health and she's having a fawn, all of a sudden now you're starting to cut back. And to be honest with you, this last fall, I can't say I saw oodles of fawns. Even when I did, it was usually one, and I saw a lot of those by themselves. And I assume that's part of the kind of response to the drought and the conditions and all that. Mom's overall health, not that they're unhealthy, they're just, when they can feast to the best and have the best forage and all that stuff, going to be healthier.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, well, do you plan for them having 2? And all of a sudden, boom. Because you've told us our white-tailed deer, the chances of them having twins after like their second years.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's
I mean, even our mule deer, when we did our mule deer research project in the Southwest, if just going off of memory, I think we had only one doe that we captured that didn't have twin fetuses when we ultrasounded them.
And you got to keep that in mind because, like you said, we're not meteorologists, and even the extended forecast is like it's hard to gauge. Are they going to have twins? Are they going to have singles? Are they going to have any? Or are they just going to skip? So that is interesting. I will ask a little bit about the harvest because the calendar switch, right?
Yep.
I know you've taken responsibility, and we appreciate that for changing the moon phases this year to coincide with the November firearm season. But the most popular, that November deer season, always starts the third Saturday in. No, excuse me, not that. It's the Saturday closest to November 13th.
Correct.
I got thinking about NASP is what I started thinking about. But the Saturday closest to November 13th. This year, that calendar kind of shifted.
Yep, this was the year that it bumps back. So it's always the Saturday closest to the 13th, which means that about 4 out of 6 years it's going to be the second Saturday, and 2 out of 6 years it's going to be the third Saturday. And it's the easy way to think about it is it always ends the Sunday before Thanksgiving.
That's what I go with, and we had one of the latest possible times for Thanksgiving this year.
Yeah, it is the latest that Thanksgiving could possibly be.
It's it kind of threw some things. Some hunters like, oh, wait a second, I got a little longer time here before season starts if I rifle hunt. But at the same token, because of that, we're a little bit towards the end of November.
Yeah,
Does that change? Because deer, they go on photo period. They don't go on dates on a calendar.
Right.
Does that later season start date, because of the calendar, have any impact on harvest that you know of, like mule deer?
I've tried to look at it, and I don't know that there's not a big enough signal or response in it that you can really ferret out, it's because of the calendar date.
As opposed too many variables.
Yeah, I think there's too many variables.
Weather.
Weather and just population changes. Our populations fluctuate enough that we don't have, consistent. There's not 20 years of almost the same harvest where you can see a little peak and valley. With some of those years. So.
And I only throw that out because I know it seems to me like I was here, and I'm not a mule deer hunter per se. I've chased them a few times. But I've often heard that whitetail begin their breeding season a little bit sooner than mule deer do.
Yeah, I think that tends to be that tends to be true on that. The muley rut tends to be just a little later, a week or so later. We did see, with our mule deer project, here 5 years ago when we collared deer in the Southwest and deer up in the Pine Ridge, mule deer, that the fawn drop date was about 2 weeks later in the Pine Ridge, and a lot of that's just associated with green up. That those deer, they're wanting to have those fawns hit the ground when nutrition's the best. So
it's amazing how nature kind of times those things out. Turkey try to hatch as those soft-bodied insects are peaking and all that type of stuff. It's just amazing that cycles that goes in there. But I was kind of curious about that. So,
and a little bit also how the harvest affects the overall goals. I guess there's a conversation that we end up having inside our office here a little bit about, getting into talking about the correct age of a deer, where's our age population of the deer, led to a lot of other conversations, but brought it back to this, like, well, what is the main goals of our deer management program? or you also talk on the larger scale if you want to talk about other big game animals too. But
Yeah.
kind of what's the age structure or wildlife population? Because earlier you mentioned you might have been at one point population doing a little too well. So what's is there that Goldilocks effect, or how's that?
Yeah, well, and I guess to start with, all of our big game management goals are just trying to keep, those populations, within carrying capacity while, providing, hunting and viewing opportunities for those wildlife. And that's a very high, 30,000 foot look at it. But what we're trying to do is, keep populations low enough that they're not causing major agricultural damage. That's something we're very responsible for, and have to work with landowners. But also we want to keep populations high enough that the deer hunting's still good, and that to manage for hunting, but not to create an excess burden on landowners. And so it's trying to find that balance. As far as age structure on deer, we don't necessarily have, we want to, I think one of the things we've got written, and it was 15 years ago or so, we wanted to keep our yearling buck harvest below, I think, 35% of the buck harvest. We're below that in every unit every year. The only ones that approach that might be some of these eastern units, Elkhorn, and occasionally Wahoo and the Blues might approach 30%. But by and large, I mean, our statewide average on whitetails has been about 20% of our buck harvest is yearling bucks. In about, well, it's about 40 and 40 for 2 and then 3+, which is really quite good. It's very different than what it was 25 years ago, where like 70% of our whitetail buck harvest was made up of yearling bucks. And so it's not really anything that we've done. It's our hunters have just decided that, hey, if I pass this yearling buck, there's a good chance he'll be 2 years old next year.
I got a question about this, and unfortunately, folks, I'm going to have to probably duck out of here, and we'll try to get this edited out around Christmas time. So, thus the Christmas shirt here. You guys aren't dressed for the holidays at all.
It's colorful. This is my colorful holiday shirt.
Biologically speaking, because to me, all right, bigger bucks, that's what we all dream about. It's kind of like when we go fishing.
Right.
You're always thinking about, man, I'd love to land that lunker bass, but we're just oftentimes happy to catch things once we get there. Biologically speaking, does changing that harvest rate of those yearling bucks impact the deer herd in any management sense other than on the hunter side?
At this point, no. We're to a point now where, we're just fine. There's no real biological issue going on with yearling buck harvest. Some of the states have seen, and even when your harvest is still made up of 70% yearling bucks, your does are all still getting bred. There's enough bucks on the landscape that, that's not an issue. It tends to be like when 90% of your buck harvest is made up of yearling bucks, means you're shooting 75% of your bucks on the landscape every year. And so that leads to issues where you may have incomplete breeding or, other things like that. And so that's where states will step in and use antler point restrictions and things like that to at least allow your yearling bucks to survive.
It can have an impact, but we're far from that here in a state like Nebraska.
Right.
When you say those numbers, I think of states out east like Pennsylvania and New York, where there's oodles of hunters, and the deer densities and some of those big chunks of timber are really, really low.
Yep. Yeah, and that was some of what, with Pennsylvania, some of their changes that they made, when they instituted APR in 2003 or something like that. They were probably at 75 or 80% yearling buck, if I remember right. But that's where a lot of that comes from, is just trying to shift some of that harvest, and shift some of the survival up a little bit.
Gotcha.
Nice. It's always interesting because I get that's a common question, or if anybody pays attention to forums or the comment section of a different post, that always seems to be brought up most of the time, was the point restrictions and all that. But I know obviously you've taken that well into account of what the goals are, what would take to reach those needs to make a switch or anything else. So is there any other big management goals that you guys have, or other standpoints that you want to try to manage throughout the time, or is it mainly just year by year? Kind of depends on what's
really,
going on.
It's really year by year. I mean, we look at every permit every year and make adjustments on those permit quotas based upon, you know, really what is it that we want to do in each of our deer management units for both whitetails and mule deer, and we'll adjust you know, those permits, you know, up and down to, you know, allow for more hunting opportunity if our populations are getting higher, or reduce that opportunity. To a certain extent, we still want to, particularly on the buck permit side, we still want to provide a fair amount of hunting opportunity just to let people hunt. We don't want to, you know, we're kind of one of those, and even some of the western states still, you know, want to make sure that their residents can all go hunt. I mean, it's a big desire for people. We really don't want to get to the point where we're kicking people out of the season, you know, just for management objectives. And by and large, we're really not to that point. You know, there's some places where we've made some of those cuts on the mule deer permit side, but those units still all have whitetail permits, so people can still go hunting. There's still a lot of that opportunity available across the state. But yeah, we look at all those permits every year, and it's you know, part of what all of these, you know, our big game meetings is getting the input and like, okay, this is the direction we need to go. This is the general sentiment across the state, or you know, it helps us identify some issues that maybe we're not attuned to, you know, at the moment. But so yeah, we'll look at everything, and yeah, we just go through everything, you know, unit by unit and then permit by permit to try to have the effect that we want to have.
Absolutely, and sounds like you're putting a lot of weight that into on those public meetings, onto that public reception, kind of what's going on with the population out there. So again, that's why you said you'll be there for a couple hours most nights, talking to people, trying to figure out what's happening. So you take public input, you look at harvest numbers. Is there any other numbers or other things that come along the facts? I'm assuming maybe a little bit of the depredation type focus, or
vehicle collisions.
We actually do. I'm working with the Department of Roads to get some of their data over the last few years. That they had an issue. Historically, we've gotten that data. They had an issue with their database here a couple of years ago, and so that's we've kind of gotten away from that. But it's something I'm working with them to get. I know they've got that database up and running again. So, but yeah, the vehicle collision data. Disease issues, you know, depredation complaints is something that we monitor on an annual basis as a part of those recommendations. You know, and then we look at the age structure. You know, it's one thing if we see something where our harvest goes up, you know, generally, or our buck harvest goes up, we see that, you know, generally is good news. But also if our age structure goes down, it means that hunters just decided to shoot, you know, younger bucks, and that may not be, you know, so it's. There's a lot of numbers that are taken in conjunction with each other that we look at. We also look at, you know, on the mule deer side, especially, we do doe fawn surveys. So we're looking at fawn production and our buck ratios there. We're trying to get some of that data on the whitetail side, but we don't have a long enough term data set yet to really have a great grasp on that. But yeah, there's a whole host of things that we look at.
More of a question of curiosity. I don't know if you necessarily have the answer, but when you look at harvest trends, obviously you could probably look by date almost when it comes to our 9-day season. So compared to that first or second weekend, do you see there's a increase? Because usually people get to that second weekend like, well, if any deer walks out, that's going to be my deer because I need to get a deer by the end of the year. Versus that first week, they're going to be a little more selective on, hey, I'm going to go for this big buck I've seen on my trail camera. I don't care if I have these smaller ones walk by. Is that something you actually see in the data, or have you ever looked into that a little bit?
I've looked at it, and our opening weekend accounts for about half of our harvest out of the 9 days. So the second weekend, there's probably a little bit of a peak, but some of that is simply because there's a lot of people that just hunt the weekends. But the opening day and those first 2 days are by and large the biggest pulse of harvest at that point. So there's not a huge you know, everybody runs out and just fills a tag on, you know, on that last Sunday. So there's not a lot of that.
Okay.
That goes on. There's some, but it's not a major component. It's not everybody hunts for 9 days and then last half hour they go fill their tag.
Right. So I was just kind of curious on that. You hear that a lot from some hunters of being very selective. Like, well, it's the end of season, so I gotta hurry up and shoot, or kind of comes to the end of muzzleloader season or something along those lines of. well, I won't be selective anymore. I need to fill my
Yeah.
freezer.
And there's no doubt that some of that happens, but it's not as pronounced as one might think.
Interesting. So
So you take all of these factors, all of this data, and the feedback from the public, and you make recommendations to the commission. And how does that
Correct.
process go
So-
through to actually make those into the next season?
So okay, yeah. One of the things we do is I'll compile a lot of this data and then I send it out to field staff, and each of our district managers works with all of their local staff, law enforcement. I mean, they actually those districts, they all have meetings where they invite their law enforcement and basically anybody that's within the agency. I think even there's some of the areas where they get some of the fisheries guys will sit in on it too and share their 2 cents. But they'll, let everybody come in and talk, and then the district managers will, formulate a local recommendation for, each permit, each unit. And then about the first week of February, we have a meeting with, all of the districts and all of our wildlife administration staff, as well as, a handful of law enforcement. We've got permits staff there. And then we'll discuss and go through literally everything over the course of about 3 days, and where we finally, make those recommendations or we fine tune them, and then to the point where we'll then take those to the agency administration, and with some discussions there. Sometimes there's things that we don't always see that they're like, oh, hey, you should take a look at this, or
Snowman
or that.
down.
Yeah, snowman
all right.
down. Oops.
our festive holiday.
Decor, yeah. But so we'll work with administration, and then at that point, once they're okay with it, then we'll move forward towards sharing them with the commission and go through that formal process where we'll introduce them like at the March meeting and get all that stuff out about that time onto the website, and then they're up for review or confirmation at the April commission meeting.
Okay.
And so then they can, either be amended or voted on or voted down at that April meeting. And then the whole process starts again. We're busy updating the website, the big game, the big game guide, as well as, getting permits, applications and all that stuff. And then the season, that cycle just starts right back over.
So they're saying they don't ever give you a break.
Yeah. But it's funny because September and August are probably strangely my slowest times with some of it, because I'm just like, it's like everything's done, everything's going,
Season's kicking off.
watching permits sell and all that. So just waiting for data to come back and start the whole cycle over.
And that's not a horrible time, because I'm assuming you probably pick up a bow every once in a while.
yeah.
You're going to
Yeah.
sneak
Oh, yeah,
out then a
that's-
little bit during
Yeah,
that time.
Yeah. I try to. Spend a lot of time
In-person
doing-
surveys.
Yeah.
That's what
Yes.
we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Field surveys.
Field verification. For sure. So, yeah.
So talking about some of those field studies and monitoring those populations, so you're talking about doe checks for mule deer. What kind of other biological surveys do you do? And it doesn't have to be just whitetail. It could be any of the other big game species that you work on.
Yeah. So those doe fawn surveys, and that's just a staff survey where they're out driving, finding concentrations, and then counting how many, in that group out on that wheat field, there's, 3 bucks, 9 does, and 5 fawns or whatever, and then move on to the next. We also do incorporate, some of our research projects, in recent years. Currently there's a mule deer project going on out in the Wildcat Hills. We've got an elk project. We're year 4 or 5 of an elk project where we've collared over 200. Well, I think this year we'll hit about 200 total elk that we've collared across, at this point, almost all of Nebraska, or all the western half of Nebraska in our major elk areas. So when we incorporate that, collar data, the survival data, as well, because a lot of those, like I was saying with that old mule deer project, we were looking at fawn production rates and fawn survival. We had a major part of that was collaring fawns. We collared like 300 and some fawns over the course of that project, just to look at their survival and all of that. So it's incorporating all of that, and then at the the check stations, when we've done that with the harvest, we'll incorporate all of that harvest data as well into our management.
So just to satisfy my own curiosity, possibly, how do you put collars on these critters?
With a helicopter and a net gun. There's capture crews that do it professionally that we hire to do that for us. They won't let me get up in a helicopter.
I was going to say, because I
almost like you have a very long list of volunteers from the agency all signing up.
I think if they saw it, they would be like, no thanks, because it's literally like you're leashed into the helicopter. They're going with the helicopter doors off, and one guy's sitting in the seat half with, he's got a tether, so he's tethered into the helicopter, but they're flying 15 feet off the ground, diving in and shooting, and it's pretty wild. I've done a little. I've never been a gunner. I've flown in helicopter surveys with the guys that do that stuff, and I've been in helicopters that are way lower than anybody would ever want to be in, and but those pilots are really good. But I have been on some captures where they've captured the animal and then relayed the processing crew, and I've been a part of the processing crew where they lower you and get you within a couple feet of the ground, but the helicopter doesn't land, and
wow.
when you're doing that, so you hop in and out, and but yeah, it's pretty wild.
I had to bring that up because I've seen videos on our YouTube channel, on the Nebraska Game and Parks YouTube page, of bighorn sheep, or I think that's what it was.
Yeah, there's a couple different ones. We actually, one of the first year of the mule deer project, we were able to, they let us strap a GoPro to the strut of one of the choppers, and so we've got a pretty good video on that, of them doing that. Of course, they don't always let you get great video, but yeah. So.
Well, you're out there to do work. I mean, the video's extra, so you got to get the work done and get the collars on and get them on there quick and get them released as quickly as you can. So,
but yeah, that's the main part of helicopters are the ones that do that for us.
Nice. No, that definitely sounds like it would be a blast to be a part of, even if instead of just doing the data collection procurement part. But you also mentioned, use the check station data, and one of the big changes we've had this year was having the option to do telecheck.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm sure you probably got asked this question a few times. What gear towards that shift, or what was on that focus shift? Because I know we've been asked that a few times. I'm assuming you have too.
Yeah. Well, I would say the start of it was when we basically had to go to telecheck. Well, it's always kind of been a slow rumble since we went to telecheck for archery and muzzleloader seasons. A lot of the firearm hunters are like, well, we do this the rest of the year. Why not let us, do this? When we did it for COVID in 2020, and we saw how quickly everybody responded and how our harvest reporting went up 10% that year, in a year that we didn't expect it to go up. So there was more people reported that year than, went through the mandatory check stations. And so there's a handful of things that go into that. People have kind of been asking about it. We knew that people would respond well to it. A lot of our check stations have been hosted at, gas stations, convenience stores, things like that. Post-COVID, a lot of those places have had difficulty hiring additional staff, or they've had staffing cuts or different things like that, where they've not been as apt to want to do it. We've in the years prior to 2020, if we might replace, there's typically about 110 check stations statewide, and we might replace 4 or 5 every year. In the 4 years after COVID, we're replacing about 15 a year. Wow. And so the turnover on them was, and it's not like, oh, you just go down to the next house or next gas station. In a lot of these places, there's only one gas station in town. Like Stapleton is a good example. The gas station used to do it. They didn't want to do it. And this was 10 years ago that this shift. This is the point where we had, there's a very nice lady in town that's like, well, we want to keep it in town. So she was actually running the check station out of her house, and so there are a lot of these places where there's just no businesses wanting to do it anymore. And so we're, and then you get to the point where we're almost knocking on doors saying, hey, is there anybody who might want to do it? And so that was part of the struggle. And then we also started looking at the map, because there's some towns we simply can't find a check station, like anybody in town. So that, and some of those were, every 30 miles apart. I actually did a GIS analysis, and there's a significant part of the state, like 30% of the state had to drive like 60 miles or more to get to a check station. It's like, oh, that's a huge burden on our hunters. So the combination of all those things, just led us to be like, okay, we're probably to this point where we need to move on and at least allow the option to telecheck during the November firearm season. The other part, one of the major data points we do get at the check stations that, when we're manning them is getting that, we cut the cheek open and we look at the teeth and get the age on it. That age data has pretty much leveled out about the last 8 years. And so that means that age data is less and less important than it's less important than it was, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when you could see some pretty when that age data would indicate, if the age structure is going up, it means that we have more deer, because there's not as much hunter selection. Well, now hunters are more apt to pass a deer than fill it on a yearling buck, and so that's totally changed things. That age data is less and less important than it was for us, and we can still collect a fair amount of it with our our hybrid approach, where we still did have a fair number of deer come to the check station. We've got a pretty good data set that we need to look at a little bit more. Like historically, we would age almost half of the bucks shot during the November firearm season. Like we were aging 12 to 15,000 deer, over for that 9 day. This past year, we still aged 5,000 deer, which is still a pretty big sample size. It was 20% of the deer harvested instead of 45, and so it's a little different. But statistically, when you look at it, if you can sample 25% of of something, that's a really gives you pretty good confidence intervals around.
Cool. Yeah, I would imagine that if you still need to do in-person checks in certain areas for disease monitoring, that you could still do age checks with that.
Right. Yep. And that's probably the direction we'll end up going with a lot of that. And it's something our hunters are used to. If we're asking for disease samples, that they're very apt to respond well to that and bring their deer in for us. So
that's great. And then and I mean, like I said, you're moving forward, so we'll probably continue to see a telecheck option then for the foreseeable future, most likely, based on how this year went.
Yep, and we'll look at that and just see, what that means for how many check stations we're going to keep open, or how many of them. It was a lot slower this year. I don't know if some of them are gonna want to stay open or not, or how that's gonna work. And if we get ones that are, I would say the towns where we've struggled to find them, if we have this last one quit, it's going to be really hard to fill. Right. And what I didn't explain is, like, with the staff effort to go replace one is about a week's worth of effort for our district managers. And, if they've got 4 of them to replace, that's a month's worth of work just to keep those check stations up and running. And so it's a huge investment on staff time and all of that. So there's probably a fair number of those that, over time that our hunters are just going to see, more than likely fewer and fewer check stations across the state. Just it's becoming harder and harder to fill them.
Well, and to my knowledge too, I mean, when we did those in the past, which now I know is going more data driven and more on the computer, but no, it used to be everybody just filled out the paper copy then got submitted to you or someone in your office, and then that had all be hand entered in each one. Yeah. So the fact that right now we can just scan our permit, half the information's already in there, that information's already correct off just getting the permit. I think it kind of goes a little bit more, making sure you have more accurate data and maybe a little bit less data entering on your end.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. It was. We had season results. We basically had everything in. There's a little bit that went in on the Monday after Thanksgiving, but like 95% of it was entered prior to Thanksgiving. Wow. Which usually it takes us about 2 weeks to get it all entered. Prior to about 2013, before we had an online system, we would actually take all those check station sheets and send them off and have somebody transcribe them for us, and we would get results like mid-January. Wow. And so it's with telecheck and this stuff starting to go online, it's kind of revolutionized just how we get our data. And yeah, if we'd go full telecheck, well, in 2020, I had season results by the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, because it was just like, well, it's all in, and everybody's checked their deer and here we go. And so the more and more we get on there, it's just, it's much faster and easier.
Easier to use, I'm sure, too.
Yep.
To run all the different tests and analysis that you guys run. So.
Yep.
Well, Luke, I know you got a busy month ahead of you here with a lot of other meetings. I know you got to go run all the way out to North Platte today, so I don't think we'll keep you much longer. But we really do appreciate you coming in, sharing all your...
Yeah, if you can't tell, I like talking about this stuff, so it's not a burden at all. I love coming in, and anybody that wants to talk about deer, man, it's hard to get me to quit.
Well, that's another part too, is if anybody does have any input or anything like to give, make sure to go and find your local meeting, or at least jump onto the Zoom meetings coming up here. I know you still have most of the meetings still ahead here in January, and hopefully we'll get this podcast out here in the next week or so. I know we're getting to the holiday season, so
yeah. And if you got any other input, you can either find my email on the website, or just go to the website and find that contact us form and send it in that way. It'll end up getting to me if there's something anybody wants to share their input. I love hearing it. And there's not been anything I haven't responded to. So
he is responsive. Even when I was in the field on a weekend on some random afternoon, like, hey, I might have a diseased deer here. Do you want samples? And all of a sudden Luke would respond right away and tell me. So he is responsive.
Yeah.
I think you probably get stuck onto social media a little too much. Days.
There's some days.
But no.
But if you want to come back and talk about deer anytime, we'd love to have you back. We appreciate your time.
Oh, for sure.
Or you get any special cool survey stories or anything like that. We love hearing them.
Yeah.
So perfect. Well, thank you so much. Make sure everybody to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel or SoundCloud or wherever you get your podcast. And remember, we'll see you outdoors.
Hunt Nebraska, brought to you by your Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.